A tribute to Mike Trister. He started and saved my legal career, the first 6 months of law practice in Mississippi. Mike Trister was my angel, not once but twice. At the beginning of my legal career in the summer of 1969, and later on in my first 6 months of practice. In one instance, he saved me from the draft or the military conscription with the possibility of deployment to Vietnam for war that I vehemently opposed. And in the other instance, saved me from facing a felony crime conviction with a possible sentence to prison and disbarment from legal practice. As my educational deferments for the draft were about to expire upon graduation from law school, I developed a cockamamie plan with a unique request for an occupational deferment. I desperately needed a job in Mississippi or another southern state. My job search looked grim after I'd exhausted all options when Mike, the director of the North Mississippi Rural Legal Services in Oxford, Mississippi, appeared as an angel on a recruitment visit and offered me a staff position. Bingo! I completed the last element for a deferment request with the odds for success about as good as hitting the lotto. I requested the type of deferment normally given for such occupations as police officer, firefighter, and school teacher that, in the words of the Selective Service System, served as the nation's health, safety, and interest. I attached a letter from Mike with the job description of my occupation as a poverty lawyer to help the poor and black people in Mississippi gain access to justice. I am still partially in shock, nearly 50 years later, that the board granted my request. Mike, you were my angel that substantiated the grounds for the deferment. Off I went to Mississippi as a black Yank from the North in Connecticut. Next, with rapid-fire summaries, and now in real life, but then from December 1969 to April 1970s, I did the following with Mike covering my back. Filed my first lawsuit in federal court and first school desegregation case in Oxford that resulted in a favorable order to desegregate the public schools. Secured the release of 4 Ole Miss African-American students, most of whom I allege the police wrongfully and collectively arrested for acts of a few fellow students who peacefully disrupted a performance at the campus theater in protest for racism on campus. The police detained the students at the state's notoriously dangerous prison farm, where prison officials armed convicted inmates with long rifles and presented them to shoot other inmates. I clogged the municipal court docket with requests for a jury trial, and the same for the University Honor Code proceedings with individual requests for due process hearings. And finally, I luckily scored one of those lawyer Perry Mason television show scenes where the witness makes a major concession on the witness stand that ends the case. On my cross-examination of a telephone company expert who testified that he traced the number of a caller who made obscene phone calls to a victim. The suspect was the minor client that I represented in this juvenile delinquency hearing. When I asked the witness if he knew the telephone number traceable to my client's family was connected to a party line with small children, he answered, no. Case closed. The prosecution could not reasonably identify the caller. How many of you remember that phone system in no dialer? The caller picks up the phone and asks for the operator to connect to the number. I guess the powerful interest in the city and county had enough of me. The sheriff called me one day to come to the jail on the pretext that a person detained requested my legal services. Instead, the sheriff arrested me on a felony charge of practicing law without a license. Once again, Mike appeared like a golden angel from heaven with the deputy director, Kent Spriggs, to not only bail me out of jail, but to win an order from a federal judge that enjoined the state criminal prosecution against me on the grounds the charges were based upon bad faith in retaliation against my client and me for pursuing the rule of law and access to the courts to resolve disputes. The judge in the juvenile case had granted me permission on the record to represent the minor based upon a common practice that I was licensed in another state, appeared in court with a Mississippi lawyer, and worked full-time for a nonprofit legal organization that represented poor people without a fee. Mike kept the sharks, who could smell the blood of conviction, away for over a year until I passed the Mississippi bar and became a licensed lawyer in the state. Both parties agreed to be bygones, let bygones, and we mutually dismissed the lawsuits. Mike Trister, You saved my legal career. I am here today, after nearly 50 years of law teaching and civil rights practice, to thank you, my guardian angel, in the old Southern vernacular. Much obliged, much obliged, much obliged.
I'm deeply honored to have been asked to participate in this Alliance tribute to Mike Trister, even though it involves following several an afternoon of very tough acts to follow. This room is full of people who, like me, have unbounded respect and affection for Mike and huge gratitude for his counsel and mentoring. For decades, he has made our social justice work smarter and more impactful. All of us look up to Mike. He is, first of all, of course, an extraordinary lawyer. He's the person we go to, not just when we need legal advice, but more importantly, when we're totally stumped about how to proceed. And his advice is always whip smart. After one meeting I had with Mike, in which he was typically brilliant, I went home that evening and, searching for an adequate way to describe how smart he had been, blurted out to my wife, "If we ever get divorced, I have dibs on Trister as my lawyer." Judy agreed that I could tell that story today. Our respect for and our reliance on Mike derives not just from his great lawyering, but from his commitment to the policy goals of his clients. Our causes are Mike's causes as well. Mike sees his job as empowering us as we seek social change. And Mike's policy experience from Mississippi to today enriches his legal advice. He also helps us see how we can magnify our impact and provide greater leadership to our communities. Because of his commitment to our causes, he pushes us to undertake more, to become models to other groups, and to assume broader leadership roles. As one example, Mike has been instrumental in seeding and nurturing the Alliance's growing nationwide efforts to embed bolder advocacy in the DNA of the progressive nonprofit sector. Similarly, Mike has helped labor leaders feel more knowledgeable about and comfortable with the law and the boundaries of their election-related work, helping them feel empowered to act more aggressively. And when it comes to protecting and inserting the right and even the duty of social justice nonprofits to speak out on behalf of their missions, as when the Alliance was subjected to a politically motivated House committee investigation, Mike has been unyielding in his assertion of nonprofit speech and association rights. At the same time that Mike empowers us to be more ambitious, we never have any worry that Mike is cutting or encouraging us to cut ethical corners. Mike chaired the DC Bar Legal Ethics Committee, and let's just say that the legal profession continuum of behavior runs from Fixer on one end of the spectrum to Mike Trister on the other end of the spectrum. I talked to a number of people from Mike's firm and from his client groups over the last few weeks, and what came through time after time was the deep respect for Mike as a counselor, as a mentor, as a crusader, and as a peer. More than once, women mentioned how supportive he had been as they built their careers in sometimes complicated environments. More than once, people I talked to mentioned how Mike's soft-spokenness, the word mumbling came up once or twice, turns to fierce assertiveness for his client when the occasion is right. Throughout, there was universal respect for Mike's tremendous talent and intellect, and deep affection for his quirks. A couple of times we laughed about Mike's tone with us for our shortcomings, a tone that Lynn Reinhardt, the general counsel of the AFL-CIO, lovingly called slightly amused, slightly bemused, and slightly exasperated. People also noted Mike's tendency to schedule business lunches at unappealing restaurants where the most positive statement on Yelp is, "It's always easy to get a table." But the universal emotions in these chats were gratitude for the depth and skill with which Mike embraces our organizations and our causes, and the profound respect, affection, and love that we have for Mike. So it's my pleasure now to invite Nan to the stage to present the Alliances Award to our attorney, our fellow social justice warrior, our advisor, and our friend, Mike Trister.
Thank you, John and Jim. And now it's my honor to invite Mike Trister to the stage. So, Mike, on behalf of Alliance for Justice, with our deepest respect and gratitude for your lifelong devotion to the cause of justice and in honor of your courageous dedication to social justice advocacy, I would like to present you with our Lifetime Achievement Award.
Thank you all so very much. As some of you know, these last few months have been pretty tough, and I was looking so much to be here. I was never really sure whether I would make it today, but I am. I've told a lot of people I look better than I actually feel, but this will make me feel an awful lot better, believe me. I want to, first of all, thank all of you for being here, for supporting me, and for your warm welcome. I want to thank Jim and JB for their comments. I could tell a lot of JB stories, but I won't. I'm not sure which of them are privileged and which of them are not. And I will tell you that when JB arrived in Mississippi in our little office on the square in Oxford, and we found a desk and an office to put him in, the first thing he did was to put up a big full picture of H. Rap Brown on his wall. And Rap Brown had just become the new head replaced Stokely Carmichael as the head of the SNCC. And I took one look at that picture and I said, things are going to be interesting around here. And they were. JB and the other lawyers on the staff were real role models, I think, for so many of the lawyers that came after them. And they were very, very important figures. The only thing I can say about Jim Weil is I never had to get Jim out of jail. But I like to think I at least kept him from going to jail. And of course, I'm very pleased that Jim and Judy never had to actually act on who was going to get me. I don't know a thing about domestic relations law, so I'm not sure who would have gotten the better of that deal if it had ever come to that. I want to congratulate the other awardees today. Some years ago, Bob Kuttner, who I don't think is here today, Bob Kuttner, who was one of the founding editors of the American Prospect, wrote that he could not imagine a strong progressive movement in this country without strong progressive unions at its core. And I think I think that the honorees who you heard about today and the fantastic work that they're doing tells you exactly what Bob was talking about back then. They really are, a Lifetime Achievement Award, I think, is what they give at the Academy Awards for people who never got an Oscar and hung around for a long enough time that they finally had to do something with them. I think that the real Oscar winners today are those honorees. They're the ones who are out there in the trenches, as you heard, and they're the ones who are fighting the fight, and we're just here to support them. I, of course, want to thank the Alliance. I've had a relationship with the Alliance for almost 50 years. I'm not exactly sure how long, but it's been a real treat. They are always in the right place. They are always working on the issues that matter, and their role in the progressive community, I think, is unparalleled. I've worked primarily, my role has been working with their Boulder Advocacy Project, or at least that's what they call it in recent years. It didn't always have such a fancy name. And I've worked with Abby and Nan particularly in filing comments and working on the issues that really mean so much to all of you as you go about trying to do the work that you're established for and what you're organized to do. And I think it's just a real treat for me to be recognized by the Alliance, given my really close relationship and the feelings I have for the Alliance and all the people who work there. Since this is a Lifetime Achievement Award, I thought that I would recognize some people who contributed to that. And then I started to think about, well, I'd have to start at that table and then just go around, and we'd all be here, and it's almost kickoff time in Russia for the 2 o'clock game. So I know that my son-in-law and my son are both here. They're looking at their watches saying, wait a second, let's get down to the real basics here. And so I decided I wouldn't mention a lot of names. But there are a few people who I have been close to who played an important role in my life and my career. And some of you may recognize their names. Some of you will only recognize a few of their names, and some of you probably are too young to recognize any of their names. But I urge you, if you don't know who they are, go home and Google them and find out more about them, because they really are some of the pioneers. And I was just very, very fortunate to work with them. I'm just going to say a word or two about them, but I do want to mention them today. Ed Sparrow, for some of you will remember Ed. Ed was one of the pioneer legal service lawyers at Mobilization for Youth in New York City. Then he founded what we came to call the Welfare Law Center at Columbia. And ultimately, he ended up teaching at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And Ed really was way ahead of his time. He really developed the idea of poverty law. He really got so many of us started. There's a bunch of us here in the room today, all of whom had the experience of working with Ed and learning from him. And so I want to mention Ed. I want to mention somebody who's not a lawyer, somebody who was a chemist. George Wiley was the head of the National Welfare Rights Organization. And there's hardly a day goes by that I don't wish that George was a better boatsman and hadn't had that awful accident in Chesapeake Bay, because we really do need an organization like NWRO, and he really put that organization together And he taught so many of us as young lawyers how to be lawyers with a movement, how to work with a social movement, and how to help that movement grow. And George and the women who were the board and who ran the organization really taught us all so much, and I don't think I ever forget the lessons that they taught me in terms of how to be a lawyer for social movements. Dan Bradley was a young lawyer in the OEO office in Atlanta when my legal service program was just getting started. We had just been kicked out of the University of Mississippi, and Dan worked with us to make sure that we survived. And he testified in the trial that George Strickler and I had against the university. But for him, I think that organization would not still be there as it is. John Britton and I had a wonderful trip a couple years ago down to Oxford for our 50th anniversary, and it was a lot of fun and seeing old friends. But for Dan, I think that program would not have survived. Later, Dan became the president of the Legal Service Corporation, the National Legal Service Corporation, and he did for the whole program what he had done for us years before. He helped to fight in Congress to keep that program alive, and I hope he'll be remembered for that for many, many years. Two people from the labor community that I also want to mention. One is Peg McCormick. When I started working with unions, and particularly on election law issues, Peg was the person you went to for advice. Peg had worked at the Federal Election Commission. She knew where all the skeletons were buried at the FEC, and she knew more about election law than any of us could hope to at that time. And it was a great loss. She worked as both at the AFL-CIO for many years and then later at the NEA. And she was their election lawyer and was really the person I turned to for help as I was cutting my teeth, so to speak, in that area of the law. And finally, Win Newman, somebody I practiced privately with for many, many years. Win was a civil rights lawyer but he was also the general counsel of two international unions, the IUE and AFSME, and he devoted really so much of his professional life to building theories and cases that would protect minority and women members of unions against discrimination. And I was privileged to practice with Win for a number of years, and I'd like to remind him there. All of these people that I've mentioned, briefly, I should say one word also about Judge Stephen Reinhardt. Duffy and I were very lucky to know Stephen before he went on the bench. He was a family friend and of Duffy's family out in California. And we got to know him. I have very strong memories of, Stephen didn't like to stay in hotels, so when he came here, he would stay with us. And I have very strong memories of him sitting up late on a Monday night watching Monday Night Football with my then 7 or 6 or 7-year-old son, now a sports writer, but at that time about this high, and they would be going at each other. And Stephen always could not believe how much this little kid knew about pro football and so on. Later, he actually, Noah, who's here today, invited him to speak to one of his classes at the Georgetown Day School, and Judge Reinhardt was very gracious and did that. and he was extremely well received. So I just want to add a personal note to my feelings about Stephen. The lesson I've learned, I think, and tried to incorporate into my practice for all these many years has been that the role of the lawyer is to assist social movements. It's to build social movements. It's not to replace them. And I started learning that when George Wiley and some of his people would bang on my head for things we had done that they didn't think were appropriate for the lawyers to be doing. But I think that has been a key element, and it's so good to see Wynn had the same message in his practice. Wynn was not just a civil rights lawyer, not just somebody who cared about discrimination, but was also someone who was building within the organizations that he was associated with, trying to build them as effective and strong organizations that could pursue the agendas that needed to be pursued. And we are, of course, at this point in time, we need that more than ever. We have an administration that I think sees the role of the law, the role of lawyers in a very, very different way. They see the role of the law really as repressing people. And you can just imagine what it is, for example, to be some of these kids who are on the DACA program, for example, and trying to have a life and trying to cope with what is coming at them and is being thrown at them at this point in time. And they are using the law to really repress people. And I think that I don't have to tell this group. When Nan told me I was going to be honored and said I could speak for a couple minutes, I said, I thought a lot about it, and I said, what could I tell this group? And there really isn't much I can tell this group. This is a group that you got the message a long time ago, and that's one reason I always looked so much forward to being at the lunch, at Nan's lunch, because it's us, it's our people, and it's so much fun to see people and to see them every year at this. But I think we do have to keep in mind, we do have to keep up the struggle and to have a different view of the law and of lawyers in the movement. And I'm sure you will all be doing that as we go forward. Thanks.